Did you ever wonder how ancient people told time before phones and watches? Well, it turns out ancient people had some pretty clever ways to figure out what time it was. Let's start with the most basic method of all, nature. See, before phones and watches, people simply watched the world around them. The sun rising in the morning and setting in the evening was like the ultimate schedule. See, farmers knew it was time to get to work when the rooster crowed and the sun peeked over the horizon. And when the sun went down and started to get cold, it was time to pack up and head home. Ancient people also paid attention to animal behavior. Birds chirping, crickets buzzing. People would listen to these sounds to estimate the time of the day. Sure, it wasn't accurate down to the minute, but if you were living in 3000, 2000 BC, it was probably good enough. But of course, watching nature only gets you so far, especially if you're trying to be on time for something like a chariot race or temple ceremony. And so ancient people got more creative. Enter the sundial. This was basically a stick or a monument in the ground that casted a shadow, and the position of that shadow told you what time it was. The Egyptians were some of the first to use them, and later the Greeks, the Romans, made more advanced versions. They even carved out hour markets to show the time more precisely. But of course, there was one huge problem with sundials. They only worked when the sun was out, obviously. If it was a cloudy day, you would have no idea what the time was. Nighttime? Well, forget it. So, unless you lived somewhere with clear skies 24/7 and had no plans after sunset, you were out of luck. And that's why people didn't just stop there. They needed something more reliable, something that didn't depend on the sun playing nice. So they turned to other clever inventions, like water clocks. So let's talk about water clocks, also known in Greek as clepsydra. The basic idea was simple. Water drips slowly from one container to another, and you mark how much time has passed based on how much water has moved. The ancient Egyptians and Babylonians used these, and later the Greeks made even fancier versions. Some had gears, floats, and even small little bells to alert people when it was a specific time. Like an alarm clock, you could use it at night, you could use it indoors, which made it a big upgrade from sundials. But even though they weren't perfect, they were still reliable enough for things like timing speeches or religious rituals, and would be used for a long time. But there were also other creative ways to track time, like using fire and smoke. So, in places where water wasn't easy to manage, or if you just wanted to light up a room a bit, then ancient people would use candles or oil lamps to measure time. These clocks worked by marking intervals on the side of the candle, letting you know how much time had passed, and hopefully nothing accidentally caught fire. The Chinese had a version that used incense. Now these weren't just about the smell, but they were carefully measured to burn for a set amount of time. And some even had tiny metal balls that would fall onto a plate when the incense stick reached a certain point, which gave you a sound indicator letting you know exactly what time it was, almost like a little alarm clock. Now, all the above ways of measuring time was more short-term. It was more for telling the time in one day. What about long-term timekeeping? Weeks, months, or even seasons. That's when the night sky comes in. See, the night sky was a giant starry clock for ancient people. What it had was constellations. See, it wasn't good at telling time in the short term, but it was extremely good at telling time in the long term because of the star patterns and constellations. Farmers, sailors, and even priests would look to the stars to track the seasons, plan harvests, religious festivals, all of that, because certain stars would rise and set at predictable times during the year, like Orion in the winter, or the appearance of Sirius before the Nile's flooding in ancient Egypt. which meant that ancient people could plan around these constellations. And so, like I mentioned before, this kind of timekeeping wasn't about the hour or the minute, it was more about the big picture timing. You couldn't exactly say, meet me at the North Star at 3 p.m, but you could definitely say the full moon means that the festival is coming. And in fact, some ancient calendars were based on lunar cycles, with months lasting from one new moon to the next. The Babylonians, Mayans, Chinese all used lunar cycles to varying degrees. Now, all these methods, from the sundial to water clocks to the stars, were eventually all replaced by mechanical clocks, which would eventually lead to the present day, where we now have computers and phones to tell the time. But it still was quite impressive what the ancient people managed to do and how they managed to tell the time. And so that was how ancient people could tell the time, both in the short term and the long term. And so, if you enjoyed this story, then leave a like, comment, subscribe for more short and long stories about ancient history.